Mr. Netanyahu says he's going to resist international pressures and fight to the end. There are new Hamas sanctions as well from Washington and London. Could you respond in both languages, please, sir?
In the face of an unfolding humanitarian catastrophe, we continue to call for a return to humanitarian pauses. We're going to keep participating in urgent international efforts towards a sustainable ceasefire, but it cannot be one-sided. We need to see Hamas lay down its arms. We need to see it release all hostages. We need to see it stop using civilians as human shields. And there cannot be any future role for Hamas in the governance of Gaza. In the meantime, we're going to continue to press and work with international partners towards a two-state solution where Palestinians and Israelis can live in peace and security in internationally recognized borders. We will continue to use all the tools that we have and look at tools that others are using as well to continue to put pressure on Hamas to cease its violence.
M. Netanyahu dit qu'il ira jusqu'au bout. Il ne veut pas céder à la pression internationale. Comment vous réagissez à ça? C'est dur d'avoir un cessez-le-feu quand la moitié ne veut pas y aller.
C'est une crise humanitaire épouvantable. Nous devons tous d'agir de toutes les façons que nous pouvons et c'est exactement ce que le Canada est en train de faire. On appelle pour des pauses humanitaires, encore une fois. On est en train de travailler avec la communauté internationale vers un cessez-le-feu durable. Mais on reconnaît que ce cessez-le-feu ne peut pas juste être d'un bord. Hamas doit déposer ses armes, doit arrêter d'utiliser les civils comme des boucliers humains et doit aussi reconnaître qu'ils auront pu de rôle à jouer dans la gouvernance de Gaza dans l'avenir. Mais nous croyons profondément, différemment de M. Netanyahu, qu'une solution à deux États, c'est la seule façon de garantir la sécurité et la paix dans la région où les Israéliens vont vivre en paix, en sécurité, à côté d'un État palestinien où les Palestiniens vont vivre en paix et en sécurité. C'est la seule chose que nous allons devoir faire.
Some people are saying the two don't reconcile with each other, and I wonder how you see it.
I think they go very much hand in hand. I think that the statement that we made with Australia and New Zealand actually underscores or elaborates on the vote. UN votes are always imperfect. UN votes are always parts of them we agree with, parts you disagree with, that kind of stuff. So they're phrased in a certain way. So if you take the vote and apply the statement we did with Australia and New Zealand, I think then it automatically makes sense.
Ought we have tried to amend the resolution like Canada did the last time to include some more of that language in the statement with the vote?
I think that the statement was a priority, to make sure that the statement was out and it was clear, and I think that was an important statement. Thanks.
Thank you. What do you think of Canada asking for a ceasefire in Gaza?
Well, I think that the Prime Minister and the government are making the right steps in terms of seeing how long this is going on for, seeing the real effect that it's having on the ground in Gaza. And I think that the timely change in tone and direction, I think, is really important. And I think it's time that we come to terms with exactly what it is that's going on and how Canada can play a role in that.
Are you worried about the divisions it's going to cause within your caucus?
Our caucus has always been very open. We've had open conversations about it all along, and I know that we'll continue to do that, and we'll continue to respect the different opinions that we have.
Thank you.
Qu'est-ce que vous pensez du vote du Canada en faveur d'un cessez-le-feu au Moyen-Orient?
Moi, je pense qu'un cessez-le-feu sans réduction totale du Hamas, c'est un permis de recommencer.
Ah oui? C'est comme si on donnait un billet aux violences?
Il y en a eu combien de cessez-le-feu depuis 1967?
Vous auriez voté contre? 9. Vous auriez voté contre, vous?
Moi, j'aurais voté contre tant aussi longtemps que les conditions ne soient pas imposées au Hamas. Un cessez-le-feu sans conditions, on va s'en voir dans peut-être pas parce que je ne suis plus ici, mais dans 2 ans, ça va être à reprendre.
Est-ce que vous pensez que c'est dangereux pour le Canada de se positionner contre son partenaire américain dans ce vote-là?
Mettons que ça chie un petit peu. Hein? Ça chire un peu. Donc, je pense qu'il aurait fallu que le Canada soit en ligne avec les Américains. On est déjà en défaut en termes de nos forces armées. On est en défaut par rapport à la protection de l'Arctique. On est en défaut par rapport à notre contribution à l'OTAN. Moi, je pense pas que c'est une bonne carte qu'on a jouée.
Est-ce qu'il y a une division au caucus? Est-ce que tout le demande, un caucus conservateur, et un peu de votre avis.
Moi, je dis mon opinion personnelle, là, pour un gars de 75 ans, puis qui a vécu trop de cessez-le-feu, et avec un ennemi de l'autre côté, qui, lui, sa seule solution, c'est d'éliminer Israël. Tant aussi longtemps qu'ils vont avoir dans leur programme l'élimination d'Israël, un cessez-le-feu, pour moi, c'est un permis de recommencer.
Mais sentez-vous que c'est une opinion majoritaire dans le caucus?
Je pense que c'est une opinion majoritaire chez les Canadiens. Les Canadiens sont pour, sont pour des arrêts, excusez-moi, temporaires pour négocier, évidemment, les otages, s'assurer qu'il n'y a pas qu'on ne tue pas autant d'enfants puis de civils, comme c'est le cas. Mais ça, je pense qu'il y a une discussion à avoir avec les Américains qui sont un peu les parrains d'Israël là-dedans, puis Israël, pour s'assurer que s'il y a une guerre là, qu'on épargne les enfants et les civils.
Sur la COP là, et l'entente sur les combustibles fossiles, qu'est-ce que vous en avez pensé?
Bien, tout le monde le dit, c'était un compromis le plus bon possible.
Just in English, what did you think of Canada's vote at the UN on the ceasefire?
As I said, I think if the condition we impose to Hamas is not a total release of, let's say, a stage, to be sure that they will not have the same goal to eliminate Israel, I think that we just give them a permit to repeat the same kind of war.
What do you think about conduct in the House recently and MPs heckling each other, insulting each other, trying to get clips for social media? What do you think about that?
Ask a question to the MPs. You want some question about the Senate? No, I don't make any comment about the other chamber. I have enough in my own one. Allez, bonne semaine à vous. Okay, au revoir.
Hello and welcome, everyone. You guys all good if we get underway? Excellent. Look, thank you so much for the opportunity to share some important news. As I've said many times in public, Canada is living through a housing crisis, but it's important to understand that the housing crisis doesn't impact all Canadians the same way. Disproportionately, Indigenous peoples in Canada are dealing with inadequate housing and suffer from very serious consequences as a result of the lack of housing provided to them. Over the course of the last number of years, there are certain measures that we put in place to help address some of these challenges. Notably, in Budget 2022, the government invested $4 billion through a distinctions-based approach to address housing needs in Indigenous communities. We've been working with Métis organizations, Métis Nations, with First Nations communities and Inuit communities to establish a path forward to address the serious housing needs that exist in communities. But it's important that we come to understand that the housing needs of Indigenous people across Canada are not limited to the challenges that exist inside the communities that they traditionally have called home. Increasingly, there are serious needs in urban, rural, and northern environments for people who do not live in Indigenous communities, but nevertheless live with extraordinary housing needs. That's why in Budget 2023 we moved forward with an additional $4 billion announcement that was going to provide supports to build more housing opportunities in urban, rural, and northern environments. Today we are rolling out that approach. We intend to do this through two key streams. The funding will be invested first through the creation of a national Indigenous Housing Centre. In order to move forward with this first key stream, we will be launching a request for proposals in January of this year with the view to selecting an organization to run the National Centre by March of 2024. This is going to provide an enormous opportunity, and we're going to empower Indigenous leaders to actually make the decisions about how this funding will be administered. The organization must be national in scope, and it will be designed by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. Importantly, through our engagement with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit leaders, we've come to understand that there is still room for a distinctions-based approach when it comes to serving Indigenous people who live in urban, rural, and northern environments. Despite the fact that there are many people who may no longer be connected to their ancestral community as a result often of government policies that may have separated from their communities over the course of their family's history, there remain a significant number of people across Canada who maintain a connection to their home community. There are in fact organizations today that are providing housing supports to members of their community who live in other parts of Canada. We will be working to co-develop an approach with distinctions-based organizations to also support the ability and opportunity for Indigenous communities from Métis, First Nations, and Inuit backgrounds to continue to provide for members of their communities who may find themselves across Canada. You'll see behind me that this has been a multi-partisan effort. There will be an opportunity for others to speak, but let me just say before I introduce some of the speakers, our partners with the New Democrats have been excellent to advocate for more funding to meet the needs of Indigenous people in urban, rural, and northern communities. In particular, Lori Idlout and Jenny Kwan have been tremendous advocates and partners to get to the announcement that we are making today. We will be giving them an opportunity to speak, but first I want to share the microphone with my friend and colleague, the Honourable Patty Hajdu.
Well, thank you very much, Sean. And I think Sean has given you some of the sort of key overviews of what's happening here today. But what's really exciting about this is really the work with the NDP to pursue a by Indigenous, for Indigenous approach. And you know, I'll never forget the announcement that we were at when Nietzsche was launched just a few months ago, or maybe it's more than a few months ago. You know, it really is the first time in the history of this country that Canada is ceding control over how dollars are spent when it's about Indigenous peoples. And this is a movement that you've seen through the work of reconciliation under the leadership of Justin Trudeau. That reconciliation is not just about equity. Of course it's about equity, but it's also about looking in those places where for a very long time the government, the various levels of government have controlled the lives of Indigenous peoples and tried to tell Indigenous peoples exactly what they needed, rather than listening to the wisdom of Indigenous peoples who have always known what they've needed. And so this is a very exciting movement. I'm really looking forward to the many people that will participate in the National Centre. Today, though, as I give you these remarks, as a director of a large homeless shelter in my previous career, I think about an individual that really touched my life, and his name was Robert Muscatouin. Robert was a very gifted and talented artist. He created many, many pieces of art, one of which I have hanging in my Hill office here in Ottawa to remind me of the importance of including voices in political process that often are excluded from the very decisions that deeply affect their life. And unfortunately, this work is coming too late for Robert. Despite all of his talent, he had many periods of episodic homelessness stemming from a life of trauma, stemming from a life of the results of colonization, and sadly, he too died very precariously housed and living on the streets of Thunder Bay. And so today I think about Robert, and I think about Laura, and I think about Lucy, and the many other names of people that I personally have worked with in my life who will benefit, who would have benefited from this work, and the many others that will have safety and have dignity because of the work that this announcement will create. Thank you.
Giving the microphone a workout. Look, thank you very much. And just before I do introduce our next speakers, let me just say that no party has a monopoly on good ideas. The work to increase investments in urban, rural, and northern housing opportunities for Indigenous people is a shared priority and outlined clearly in the Supply and Confidence Agreement. And I just want to say once again what a tremendous experience it's been to work with my colleagues Jenny and Lori, who've been stalwart advocates for housing for Indigenous peoples across Canada. And I'd like to invite them to the microphone to share a few thoughts on today's announcement. Thank you so much.
It's good to see the technician earning his keep today. Sivolome koyerego mavunga taksumunga naragyak togase tana nilio tegeyavut pimmagerongman inurimangno nunakakaksima yurimangno ikayong nekangnyaktok tekwa kema yuvinit nunagayang minnik angakaktakon ng nerang mata angakaktak padlian nerang mata kemay garwak pata kalunano garwak pata angakaksaganyak tangin sakit to kang nyang mata na pimagero ikayo tigiyabot koyarit tigibaka. What I just shared in Inuktitut is that this is indeed a very important announcement. There have been too many Indigenous peoples, Inuit, First Nations, and Métis, who have been compelled to leave their home communities to seek better opportunities in urban and rural centers. Too many Indigenous peoples that left their homes to attain their education or seek employment. There are too many stories of Inuit women, for example, being murdered because they chose the wrong house to rent. So this important announcement really will save lives. The Urban Rural Northern Housing Initiative is a very important dent. What I've been saying from the beginning is that while $4 billion over 7 years is not enough, it will do what it's intended to do, and it will help save lives. And it's been such an honor to work with my colleague, MP Jenny Kwan, and all the various ministers in the Liberal government to make sure that we can make this announcement today.
Great. Thank you very much, Lori, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very delighted to join with the Minister Fraser, and his colleagues, Minister Hajdu, as well as Minister Anand and Minister Vandell, and my other colleagues, Daniel Blakey, Blake Desjardins, and Leah Gazan, and of course, Lori Idlout. For the NDP, all the way through, in a minority government, we knew what we had to do. We had to come here to fight for the people. And one thing that is clear is that in the housing crisis, all too often, Indigenous peoples, Inuit and Métis peoples are forgotten. We know the statistics. The reality is that Indigenous peoples are 11 times more likely to be unhoused. If you look at the community around, you look at my riding in Vancouver East, we are the third largest urban Indigenous community in the country. The encampments are full of people who identify as First Nations, Inuit and Métis, who are unhoused. They are people who's died waiting for housing. So we know why we're here and why we need to do this work. So for years, we've been pushing the government to invest in housing. And we know that investing in housing will save lives, is economically sound, it is socially sound, and it will save lives. So to this end, with respect to Indigenous housing, in Budget 2022, we were able to fight and secure $4 billion for distinction-based housing, which is for people living in their home community to address the housing needs that they have. It's not enough, but it is an important investment. With that, we also were able to secure $300 million for people living away from the home community. $300 million we knew right off the top was not enough. So we redoubled our effort, and we were able to secure in Budget 2023 another $4 billion over 7 years investing in for Indigenous, by Indigenous housing, and for people living away from the home community. The government knew as well all along in this work, as far back as 2 mandate letters ago, that there needs to be a national Indigenous-led housing center. So fast forward to where we are today. We have finally arrived at that place where the announcement is being made that the process will be undertaken to put forward a national for Indigenous housing center. And that $4 billion will ensure that urgent unmet needs will be available for people in the community. The significance of this announcement was really something that was achieved last year with Nietzsche, when we made the announcement to say, for the first time in the history of Canada, that the federal government recognized the rights of housing for First Nations, Inuit and Métis people living away from their home community per the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People. I can't tell you how meaningful this is, and now with the work that will be embarked on to get the National for Indigenous, by Indigenous Housing Center in place, it will mean that this is a new beginning of reconciliation. That is reconciliation in action. It means to say that Inuit, First Nations, Indigenous and Métis people living away from their home community will no longer be ignored. And in fact, about 80% of that population live away from their home community. Their housing right must be respected, and this is the beginning of that announcement. So the NDP fought long and hard for this. I am very proud of our entire team, of our leader, who backstopped the both of us in this fight to get us to where we are today. And I'm looking forward to working with Minister Fraser and with his team and the Liberal government to complete this work. This is just the beginning of the announcement until the housing is built, until people who have urgent unmet needs are properly housed, until lives are saved. The job is not done. And we will always be there to stand with the people in our community, and we will collaborate with the government to get this work done. Thank you so much.
That concludes our formal remarks. We're happy to take a few questions should anyone have them for us.
Just walk us through how this will translate to more housing for Indigenous people.
Well, certainly, and look, the case can be made in a fairly straightforward way. There's going to be $4 billion additional dollars that's going to go directly towards the construction of housing developments. What's fascinating, though, is we're doing something different here. We've made a decision to empower Indigenous leaders to make decisions about how the money is actually going to be spent. My view is that the decisions about the needs of Indigenous people will not be met if those decisions are made in boardrooms in Ottawa. Indigenous leaders know what their communities need. They know what their people need. And if we empower a National Indigenous Housing Centre led by Indigenous people, designed for Indigenous people, I trust they will be able to make decisions about how they can best meet the needs of Indigenous people who have housing needs that are currently unmet in communities. In my own home province of Nova Scotia, I can point to a very successful analogy. When I was growing up, the Mi'kmaq students that attended school in Nova Scotia, when it was run by the provincial government, had a very low rate of graduation, about 1/3 of the rate compared to the average student in the province. A decision was made to hand the keys over to decisions about how the education system was going to be administered to an organization across the province, Mi'kmaq. What we ended up seeing was a complete revitalization of the education system for Mi'kmaq students. When Indigenous leaders, Indigenous people were entrusted to make decisions about what they needed, they made better decisions. The graduation rate today is on par with every other student as a result of empowering people to make decisions about their own communities. We're applying the same principle now through a different fund that's meant to support the unmet housing needs for Indigenous peoples who live outside of their home community. By empowering a national centre to make decisions and distinctions-based groups to make decisions about how they can support their people, our view is that over the next number of years, we're going to see many new projects get off the ground that will be best designed to meet the needs of people whose needs are currently unmet.
What's the relationship between the National Indigenous Housing Centre and the government? I'm assuming it's not going to be a Crown agency. How does that work?
No, it's going to be in an organization that will make decisions independent of government. We're going to hold a process to select the organization that will run the centre. That process will launch in January, and we will select the successful proponent in March of 2024. Once the funding is in the hands of the organization, to the extent that they are interested in our perspective or would like advice or support, we will be there to answer their calls. But what's extremely important is the decisions that organization takes will not be dictated by the federal government. They will be made by the organization, and that is a fundamental principle of how this policy is going to operate.
So the federal government will just be a funding partner in that case?
Essentially, that's during the setup process. Of course, we will assess the request for proposals, but we will be a funding partner. And please, if others wanted to chime in on the answers, let me know.
Have you got a rough estimate of how many homes need to be built?
How many homes need to be built? Patty, I don't know if you've got the estimate. I think this is sort of shared space for us.
Well, I think it's hard to quantify in actual numbers of units that need to be built, but the need is astronomical. Across the country in First Nations, for example, although we've made astronomical investments, in fact, 1,100% more than the previous Conservative government spent on housing alone in First Nations. Still, housing comes up as the primary concern when I meet with First Nations communities, when I talk to Métis leaders, when I talk to Inuit leaders, as the first priority for their communities. And so that gives you an indication of the challenge that we have in First Nations communities. But in municipalities, of course, as I think my colleague Minister Fraser said and MP Kwan said, Indigenous people are deeply overrepresented in the numbers of homeless people or people experiencing homelessness. In the shelter that I ran, for example, it was about 80% of the people who used the shelter services were Indigenous descent. And that's no surprise when we're talking about the surviving of colonization. Many people have either personally survived institutions like residential schools or the 60 Scoop, or their parents have been deeply affected. People have experienced deep poverty in many times in First Nations communities. Of course, there's no generalization. Everybody's story is different. But the impact of growing up as an Indigenous person in a country that has been colonized, and you're not a member of the colonial descendants, means that it's been a challenging journey, and so that's why we see those numbers in such the degree that we do.
Maybe I can just add this additional piece of information. By way of a housing gap that is required to address the housing crisis for Indigenous peoples, we're looking at about $340 billion housing gap. And so the announcement over the last 2 years that we were able to secure from the government in this regard is a $8.3 billion investment. So there's a long way to go in addressing the housing needs. And that's why this is so significant, with dedicated funding that's led by Indigenous people to address their housing needs. And obviously, more work needs to be done, and we'll continue to work with the government to address the crisis.
Just an unrelated question.
I have one on this.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
We'll have to take a short break for parade, and we'll come back after the question.
Oh, the parade's coming.
No, parade's a minute out. A minute?
Yeah. Okay. We'll take a break for a minute. We'll let the parade come through.
Let's hear the question.
Hi, it was for Minister Fraser, I guess. I'm just curious if you can explain why the need for a specific center for this issue. For example, when it comes to municipalities, you deal with them one by one directly as a federal government. Why can't you take that approach with Indigenous communities? Why have a center? Does it create more bureaucracy?
No, I take a different view because the need is so clearly national in scope that we need to have an organization that has national capacity to actually address the issue. There are individual municipalities that are dealing with a very common problem, but one of the things that we want to overcome is the idea that this is something that we can deal with one community at a time. The reality is neither the federal government nor municipal leaders will understand the needs of Indigenous people with unmet housing needs the way that Indigenous leaders who have experience in dealing with unmet housing needs will understand where to find the solutions. So we are going to be pulling in, as a result of this request for proposal process, the best minds who have experience dealing with these challenges right across the country. I'm very much looking forward to seeing the submissions. We know that there is expertise out there today, and to identify solutions that are not led by the government but led by Indigenous leaders is going to provide, in my view, a greater opportunity for us to make meaningful progress to solve a challenge that is national in scope. Certainly.
I would just say, look, in a community like Thunder Bay, where, as I mentioned earlier, Indigenous people are disproportionately represented in the numbers of people experiencing homelessness, nothing prevents a municipality from focusing their energy and attention on the needs of Indigenous people who are now residents of their community. In fact, we have to kind of get over this us and theirs and whose people are they question. In fact, we are each other's people. And so when communities and municipalities embrace the idea that by providing better supports, better programs, Indigenous involvement in the delivery of municipal programs, that actually everybody will do better, I think we'll really start to see progress. But I agree with my colleague, Minister Fraser's comments, that the centre will be able to more rapidly and more adequately meet Indigenous organizations and housing providers where they're at with the supports and the financing they need.
From my colleague Alessia Passafume. It's about language funding provided to the Nunavut, am I getting that right? Community Council. Her question is, why did your government provide language funding to this community council amid concerns from ITK that they are not a legitimate Inuit group, and when your office said that the council is not receiving resources deemed for Inuit?
Funding for Indigenous languages is provided by Heritage Canada, and I think that question may be best posed to them.
Maybe just a general question to Minister Fraser. When this session started, cost of living, housing, it was meant to be the first priority of the government. A lot happened during this session. Do you still have the conviction or the feeling that you could make it the very first priority, and what results people are going to see concretely? Is that enough for people, and can they really sense that it was a priority in the midst of all what happened in the session?
Look, thank you very much. And as we come up just days away from the end of the session, I've been reflecting a little bit on the progress that we've achieved since things began in September. When I was first appointed to this position, there was no question the needs when it came to housing facing Canadian communities are extraordinary. We have made significant progress, but in my view, we have a long way to go. Despite the fact that we know there is a long road ahead, I am filled with a relentless sense of hope and optimism, not out of blind faith that tomorrow will be a better day, but out of my experience dealing with the people who know what the solutions are and who are implementing them and sharing their solutions with us so we can implement them to build more homes as quickly as possible. I look back just at the course of the past few months. The first thing we set out to do was to try to make the math work for home builders. We removed the GST from new apartment construction, which we expect will create between 200,000 and 300,000 homes over the next decade. We recapitalized the Canada Mortgage Bond Program, which will translate into about 300,000 homes over the next decade. We've moved forward with the Housing Accelerator Fund, and with the deals that we'll have signed by the end of this week, we expect that over the next 10 years, according to the projections not of the federal government, but the cities we partner with, to see another 250,000 homes built over the next decade. We continue to move forward with innovative solutions like the catalog of pre-approved designs that we've launched, that we announced just yesterday. And every step of the way, when we continue to make investments to build more homes, continue to make investments in affordable housing for low-income families, and listen to experts on the ground about how we can change the way that we build homes in the industry and change the way that we permit homes at a municipal level, I have faith that we can get where we need to be. There is a lot of work ahead to do, but given the progress we made just over the past few months, I have faith that we can make a meaningful difference, and I hope Canadians see that we're going to continue to work every day to build as many homes as possible to restore a level of affordability so people can look forward to being in a place that they can afford and potentially owning a home one day for themselves.
Bill C-56 is still before the Senate. The Senate is just starting to review it. So the GST exemption, the rebate, well, it is announced, long time announced now, but it's not like... C'est pas en vigueur concrètement pour les remboursements et au niveau de tout ce qui a été fait, c'est quand même bien loin des 3,5 millions de nouvelles habitations que la SCHL dit que ça prendrait d'ici 2030. Donc, comment on rétablit la mathématique?
Oui, c'est OK pour moi parce que le secteur a besoin de certainté. Et maintenant, c'est très important de réorganiser l'impact de TPS, par exemple. Et en effet, le 14 septembre, à le moment où nous faisons l'annonce, le secteur comprend ce programme et en effet, pour chaque jour après l'annonce. Mais le projet de loi dans le Sénat du Canada, c'est très rare. Le Sénat a rejeté sur un projet de loi pour les enjeux financiers. Sorry, I'm saying it's very rare that the Senate would reject a government spending bill of that nature. I have full faith that Bill C-56 will be in effect, and we've given certainty to the sector by announcing that we'll actually be in play as of the date of the announcement, as most tax measures would be. So when we continue to move forward with announcements to provide certainty that support will be there retroactive to the date of the announcement, I have faith that the sector is going to respond accordingly.
For the 3.5 million from the
with CMHC.
You didn't
No,
commit
sure.
to that.
Yeah, so what we're working towards right now, the goal outlined in the CMHC supply gap report of an additional 3.5 million homes. What's important to understand is the federal government has a very important role to play, but no one level of government can do this on their own. We're going to need to bring provinces with us, bring municipalities with us, the private sector, and importantly the non-profit sector to grow the stock of social housing in this country as well. My belief is that we can put forward the federal measures that make that goal possible, but we will need the participation of other levels of government and other players in home building to actually turn it into a reality. So task number one for me is to put forward a comprehensive plan that will make it possible for Canada to achieve the supply gap that was outlined in the CMHC report, and I have faith that we'll be able to achieve that in the months ahead. Thank you.
Sur Canada Vie, est-ce qu'il y a quelque chose que vous pouvez dire aux fonctionnaires ou qui peut être fait pour les fonctionnaires qui attendent après le comité sur Canada Vie là, pour que les choses se règlent? Est-ce qu'il y a quelque chose qui pourrait être fait temporairement, les gens qui ont des problèmes avec leurs assurances, qui sont toujours pas remboursés? Est-ce qu'il y a quelque chose qui peut être fait pour eux?
Nous continuons de travailler avec le Canada Vie pour améliorer la situation pour les fonctionnaires avec les prestations. Premièrement, le Canada Vie a décidé d'augmenter leurs travailleurs au centre d'appel. Et nous savons que le temps d'attente au centre d'appel est court maintenant. C'est 1 minute, 2 minutes là pour avoir l'aide là. Donc nous savons qu'il y a de travail à faire, mais la situation est mieux qu'avant.
Oui, mais les gens qui attendent leur remboursement, concrètement, je veux dire, en quoi est-ce que la situation est mieux pour eux s'ils ont besoin de l'argent? Parce que les dépenses médicales, ça peut être énorme.
Je sais, et je comprends la question. Et avec les remboursements aussi, le Canada Vie travaille très fort pour continuer de s'assurer qu'ils peuvent continuer de rembourser les fonctionnaires. Et il y a des améliorations avec ce travail.
Quand est-ce que ça va revenir à la normale?
C'est presque normal pour avoir l'aide nécessaire, mais s'il y a des problèmes, il y a une route avec un site web où on peut appliquer pour plus d'aide nécessaire. Si on n'a pas l'emboursement nécessaire, on peut dire et discuter le problème avec les fonctionnaires.
OK, fait qu'en termes de solutions temporaires, vous dites qu'il y a un site web, il y a une ligne d'appel, le délai d'appel est plus lent, mais au niveau des remboursements, c'est pas plus rapide en ce moment.
Non, ce n'est pas le cas. Je pense que... Est-ce que vous avez essayé d'appeler le centre d'appel?
Non, mais j'essaie de me faire rembourser.
Parce que maintenant, il y a le temps très court d'avoir l'attention. Et avec les remboursements aussi, c'est plus en plus court le temps au centre d'appel. Donc, je sais qu'il y a de travail à faire, mais je sais aussi qu'on a vu des améliorations avec leurs services pour les fonctionnaires. Donc, je dois dire.